Hey guys, Thomas Sicily Jr. here, aka Mustached, here to review the movie Godzilla, the Planet Eater. Now, before I can officially begin my review, I must say that I thought the previous movie, that being the movie I'll link in the description or the review to it that I did, I thought that that was the first movie and that this was a sequel, but after seeing a few reviews, I actually discovered that this was a part of a trinity and that there was a first Godzilla movie that I had actually missed, and that this movie was actually the third installment of a Godzilla trilogy. So, while that doesn't change how I feel about the movie, it might change how you feel about the movie, depending. So, this movie, uh, what, but actually, another quick note that there will be spoilers for this, towards the end. So, with that being said, now let's begin with the little recap and what I thought. So, this movie starts with right where we left off, with our some narration and these people who had been watching Godzilla. And this narration is talking about how that we needed a hero to essentially someone to help inspire to activate God, as they refer to it as, or something along those lines. And we are rejoined by our hero, Herero, or I think it's Hiriro. I'll just call him Hyro for pronunciation's sake and for simplicity's sake. So, Hyro is the character who is getting more and more upset at Godzilla for the destruction that it had caused. However, upon trying to defeat Godzilla in the previous movie, he would not activate this Mecha Godzilla town that they were in to fully utilize its power to fully destroy Godzilla. For whatever reason, he could not find it within himself to completely defeat Godzilla. But they did manage to get it to rest at the very most. So, with that being said, the people on the ship, I forget what the name of it is called, the Arcobello or something like that, are arguing over what they want to do with the main hero. Some people believe that he did not go in the order of what they intended for him to do, that being take out Godzilla, and the others said that what they did was just enough. So, back on the planet, in the little village that they are inhabiting, him and his co-pilot, I forget his name, but I know who he's voice acted by because I hear him when I see the Unexpectables D&D campaign played by Edward Bosco. So I'll just call the co-pilot Ed for short because I don't know his actual name. So Hyro and Ed are talking over what these other people on the ship plan to do, and the other people are that survived truly believed that Hyro had saved them, and that God is what saved them as well. So, they meet, or they re-meet Mephis, or Mephis, I think that's how you pronounce it. So, this person is starting to congregate what is essentially the equivalent of a religious cult among the people that are remaining there. So, he intends to do that, and is attempting to use this so-called miracle, or God as he refers to it, to fight off Godzilla. And he says that because he can understand that through the power of math and technology that they can understand what this God is. And as I mentioned once, he used said God to kill Godzilla. Excuse me. So poured back on the ship of the Billa Saluda. I actually did write that down. Thank goodness. Some units are moving around, and back on the small planet Earth, wherever they are, Mephisto is now being sort of presented as this new leader. He's congregated his people, and they are now starting to pray together. I believe it was Miona, one of the two twins, that joins Hyro, and as well as Ed, and the three of them are talking about what's going on. And she's talking to Hyro one-on-one afterwards about his doubt and his fears. And in a display, she offers herself in a literal, like, we are going to have a baby. There's no other way to interpret that. But he does reject it at that moment in time. So, as we cut back to Mephisto, he's placed some sort of device, this little green tower-like thing, which is allowing him to communicate with this other alien-like human figure that can also communicate telepathically. And him and the other twin, Mino or whatever, I forget the differentiates between the twins, honestly. Mephisto pretty much talks about this golden demise, as he refers to it as. And Hyro joins Mephisto after the twins' visit, but it ends up being this weird dream sequence. But as we are seeing that these humans that had been following Mephisto are now starting to pray to Ghidorah. And what they're saying is that they want to be devoured to win. And of course, this is a obvious, very obvious, like, this sort of representation of a cult doing some sort of ritual that involves sacrifice, of course. So, we do see that the people are starting to get killed off, and the last person manages to let out a scream before a part of Ghidorah slices him up. And thus, this allows Ghidorah to appear in a more omnipresent-like form. And it starts to surround the ship. So, as this is going over, and it's making the ship freak out, and making time wonky around everything that is involved in the ship, this makes Godzilla open its eyes and start to begin to move. Meanwhile, all the humans that are left are moving towards this watchtower to finally figure out what the heck is going on. So Godzilla is starting to move, and Hyro is as well towards Mephise's location. And they see, the humans, that Ghidorah is moving in. After taking down the entire ship and killing everyone on it, that is. So, Godzilla attempts to blast down Ghidorah, but is put to no use. The blast that Godzilla does is simply redirected. And Ghidorah is able to bite down on Godzilla. And as I've seen on a few other reviews, I did watch a few reviews before putting my thoughts together. There were a lot of people that say that the third act of this movie is extremely disappointing. But I will go over just the recap portion and I'll tell my thoughts on it. So anyways, Hyro gets to Mephise's location and he wants to sacrifice their kind so that they can end it all. And he's praising for everyone's demise. So Hyro is put under this control and passes out. He's placed in this void-like area where Mephise uses his mind powers to manipulate and begin to explain his ideology. So, Godzilla tries or attempts to heat up his body, but Ghidorah, being still ever present all around Godzilla, is able to cool Godzilla right back down. So the people are watching and trying to figure out what is going on from their location. So, Godzilla starts to float upwards. And Hyro starts to begin mind fighting Mephise. And I put a dash in his... And you might as well say he's kind of also simultaneously fighting Ghidorah as well in a mental battle. So Ed goes with one of the twins, I believe it was Miona, and she with along him go to this egg and they are able to summon forth Mothra, the butterfly kaiju, and make it appear in Hyro's vision. So this allows Hyro to break free. And with Hyro's effect on Mephise, this allows Ghidorah to become a physical presence and allows for Godzilla to take advantage. So, Hyro remembers that his name was Hope, or translates to Hope. And thus, Hyro breaks Mephise's eyes, and this kills him in the process. Apologies for that bad cut. Anyways, as I was saying, so yes, let's see, where was I? Oh yes, Hyro manages to essentially kill Mephise and allow Ghidorah to essentially become a physical presence. Thus, Godzilla is able to fire blast Ghidorah out of the sky. However, Hyro still, even with all of that, still feels a pain, guilt, and sadness over Mephise's death. Then it cuts to a passage of time where him, and as long as his people, start to migrate within the population of the girls that inhabited this area. It shows them growing up, it shows them mating with some of them, it shows them having kids, so on and so forth, including the main character. So, Ed says that he was able to rebuild one of the machines, one of the Valkyrie, I believe they called it, with nanomachines, son. And Hyro hears this, and then he starts to hear Mephis's or slash Ghidorah's voice. Might as well again combine those two, um, and thus knowing that Ghidorah still lives in his mind space, he makes a decision that he wants to go out and use this mech that Ed just built to essentially fly and Kazakami himself into Godzilla, in which Godzilla blasts his ship and the main character of our movie dies. And that is how Godzilla the Planet Eater movie ends. There we go. And while I do agree to the extent that the actual action itself was a little subpar, I do believe that the context behind the fight is actually where this movie becomes equally as impressive. The subtext of the fight is actually what I was paying attention to rather than the fight itself. And I think that when I did that, I think that is when the movie became far more impressive than I thought it was going to be. You see, there's a lot of complicated things that actually happen in this movie. There is a lot, and I mean a lot of ideological battles happening in this movie. And I think that when you start to see Godzilla as an ideology rather than a kaiju that you want to see in a kaiju battle, I think that is actually what makes Godzilla Godzilla instead of, what we want to see in a Godzilla movie, that is Godzilla fighting, a kaiju. And don't get me wrong, I'm pretty sure there is a part of me that wants to see that too. Sure, I want to see Godzilla kick butt, that's fine. And you know what? There is always probably gonna be a place for that, sure, I agree. But I do think that Godzilla as a concept is also just as interesting. To me, that is what makes Godzilla stick out. It's not that Godzilla is a kaiju, but rather he is an ideology. And to me, that is what made this movie really stick out. It's not that Godzilla is a kaiju in this, but he represents an ideology. He represents a new hope. But he does not start out that way in the previous movies. In the previous movies, he starts out as a destructive beast that, in the backstory of Hyru, we see destroy his hometown. But when Ghidorah is summoned, it is then that Ed and company, the people, the humans watching from the tower, start to believe in Godzilla. They start to chant and fight in support for Godzilla. They start to believe in a new hope, the ideology. So if Godzilla represents the ideology of hope, then what does Ghidorah represent? Well, that is a much more clear image, as they pretty much spell this out. Ghidorah is a representation of inevitable death, that everyone on this planet will eventually die. That is what Ghidorah represents. And in that sense, we can't see Ghidorah or Godzilla as either ultimate hero or ultimate villain, because these ideologies are not perfect, but they are just concepts that exist, that are real. And yeah, that is kind of scary. Ghidorah's concept is actually really scary, that everyone does die. That is what Ghidorah represents. And in that way, There is a lot of fear to be had when thinking about Ghidorah, and the way that Ghidorah is able to manipulate situations and be this omnipresent-like form. We can't see death. That is what is so beautiful about this. We can't, even with all the technology we have later on in the film, the third act, we cannot see death because it is something we cannot see coming. We cannot predict when we are going to die. It is something that just happens. And there is a beauty to that ideology. And there is a fear behind that ideology as well. The same thing is said for Godzilla, A New Hope. That there is a lot to, there is a lot of people that would naturally seemingly flock towards that ideology, I think, more than, giving in to Ghidorah, giving in to this inevitable we are going to die mentality. And in there is some sort of peace that will come with when we die, but if we are dead, then how are we then able to see that peace? That is the issue with it. If there is nothing left to be left lived, then how can we experience it? We are not there to experience it, thus it's sort of this, there is an end point, and there is nothing beyond that end point. And for Godzilla, again, he is a newfound hope. He's not the hope that we started with, but he is the hope that the humans started to believe in, again, in that third act. And Hyro's name, or his official name, translates also to hope. And his self-hope is something that still hated this new hope. It held a grudge against this new hope, this new future. He refused to believe it, and in fact, he started to shift over to Ghidorah's side in a sense as he Kazakami'd himself to Godzilla. He started to hear the voice of Ghidorah. He started to shift into thinking that if I die, and if I am allowed to choose to die, if I kill myself, this will erase the omnipresence of Ghidorah from everyone else. But despite that, that is simply never going to be true. Despite every effort that Hyro makes in this movie, including killing himself, that is not true, because he has an offspring. So technically, his blood carried on to the next generation. Thus, if this movie were to have a fourth installment, which I actually highly doubt, but if it were to, and if his offspring became the main character, then Ghidorah would find a new way in, if it wasn't still already existing in one form or another because of what Ghidorah represents. Remember, Ghidorah represents an ideology itself that can never truly die. That being the concept that we all eventually die. And that's never going to go away. But neither is Godzilla. And that, again, I think is the true beauty of this movie. It's not about two monsters fighting. It's about these ideologies clashing, and I think when I started to look at that movie from this perspective, I actually started to see a real beauty behind it. And sure, again, I can see why people would be disappointed that the actual battle, the representation of the battle was extremely limiting. It was extremely, simplistic in a way. But to me, it wasn't about the fight. It was about what the fight represented. It wasn't just people or creatures, or kaiju in this case, fighting. It was the ideologies themselves that were fighting. And to me, that actually speaks higher volumes than the actual fight itself. And I will say this, is that this movie to me is an embodiment of never judge a book by its cover, or in this case, never judge a movie based on its title. Yes, the title is deceptive. There is no mistake about that. Godzilla, the Planet Eater. He does not eat a planet, obviously. Uh, but just because that is the case, I decide to look at a movie and look for things that I don't think a lot of people take into account. At least that is something I have been trying to practice a lot more of. And I do think that in the third act, I actually think, as simplistic as the battle is, and I've seen the people complain about it, I actually think that it's the most beautiful part of the movie, believe it or not. For as simple as it is, again, it is the ideology aspect that I think that truly makes this movie actually something rather beautiful and kind of scary simultaneously. There's so much range of emotions that happen throughout this movie. All these ideologies that have been following Godzilla, quite frankly, ever since its inception. Again, I think when I started to look back at what other people have said about Godzilla and what he represents, and when I started to think about it in that way, I think that is when this movie became so much more better, especially that third act. To me, it was not about having a flashy fight, and again, I am going to be a high believer that there is always going to be a place for that. You're gonna always have your specific rim where you get your mechs versus your kaiju and they just fight. There's always going to be a place for that, and I do think that's always going to exist. However, for Godzilla, I do think that there is a higher priority in the ideology behind Godzilla that is actually what it's meant to be. And in fact, there has always been this sort of higher argument about, how long Godzilla is in a Godzilla movie. Even in previous films of like, oh, he's only in it for like 10 minutes or whatever. And you get a lot of disappointment of like, oh, well, the movie's called Godzilla, or whatever subtitle there is after that. So there's always this prompt of, oh, it should be about Godzilla all the way through. Obviously, like that's like the typical, like one of the very common complaints I've heard about previous installments, and including this as well. However, as I mentioned prior, I don't think that just getting a Godzilla movie would actually be as satisfying as people think it's going to be. When I look back and I think about all the Godzilla movies that I've seen clips of there's always this, there are always humans involved. That's a element that I don't think is going to fade away from Godzilla. There is always going to be a human aspect or some sort of element of that going on in all of these movies. I think it's always going to be a balance between humans and Godzilla rather than, it being just about Godzilla. And I think that's sort of always been the point. Just like the ideology part of it, it's about this balance. And, again, what Godzilla represents in this movie, I think for the amount of time that he is in it, I think it makes sense. I think it actually fits him representing a new hope. This is, when you think about that from an ideological standpoint, it coming at the end of something actually is something rather beautiful if you think about it. You go through all of this despair, you go through all of this sadness, all of this death, all of this, whatever bleak thing you can think of, and at the very end of it all, you have hope. You have Godzilla. And that to me is actually rather beautiful. So, this movie helps me see Godzilla in a whole new light that I have never thought to see in him before. And it took me watching a few other reviews and actually thinking about it to realize these elements. And to me, I think that's what makes this Godzilla movie extraordinarily good, especially the third act. I think it's actually one of the most beautiful endings I've ever seen in a long time. Hell, I would argue that this movie is actually one of the better animated movies I've seen in a long, long time. I'm gonna give Godzilla, the Planet Eater, a 9 out of 10. I thoroughly enjoyed this movie. I enjoyed thinking about this movie. I enjoyed the surprises that this movie held. It threw me off completely, and I absolutely enjoy when a movie can do that. And enjoy when a movie can make me think about all of these things. And I really, really think that this movie is highly underestimated and highly underlooked, based on the reviews I've seen so far. I've not seen any super big reviewers, at least any reviewers that I typically watch review this movie, and I think that kind of shows where this movie is in terms of main surface reviewers that are the big, they typically review the hot topic latest movie. I think this movie got completely slept under the radar, completely 100%. This movie is absolutely beautiful. It might not be a animated marvel, the movie that everyone was praising, and I still see a lot of praise for in Spider-Man Into the Universe. However, where that, I believe, was a clustered mess of a disappointment, I think a movie like this is what people should be asking way more of. A movie that makes you think so much more. A movie that has so much more focus to it. And yeah, it does have its issues. Hell, I did say 9, but I could very well drop it to an 8. I do think that there were definitely some things that could definitely make it that, or even a solid 7, but I would not drop it below a 7, that is for sure. I would definitely not drop it below a 7. This was definitely something that was still surprising, even with its faults. I think its faults are, in the end, rather minor. I think some of it revolved around the twin characters, kind of being a little bit vague in what they were trying to accomplish there. But other than that, there wasn't really anything that made me think, oh, this movie's really bad. Even if the fight itself was, as some might have said, more simplistic. I don't think that if a fight is simplistic, I don't think that makes a movie bad. Not in the slightest. I don't think that is fair. I don't think that is a fair criticism to make when you can think of a fight in a much more beautiful, well-crafted way. Not every fight that you see on screen has to be, a back and forth, crazy clash. Think of movies like Batman vs. Superman, right? That movie disappointed half of the fans that watched it and half enjoyed it. And, the people that enjoyed it probably are mostly talking about the fight and how much of a spectacle it was, rather than the entire movie as an entity, the entire thing, what cultivated into that fight, um, and how that fight ended. I think a lot of people, I think the people that don't like it, I think that there is a little bit more to be said about what went into that than the criticism gives it credit for. As I mentioned, I did actually enjoy Batman vs Superman all that time ago, and I'd still hold on to that because of the back stuff. You know, what built up to that fight. I think that is what helps elevate a fight. Uh, putting aside what type of spectacle a fight has in it of itself. Again, I don't think it is fair to say that this movie is bad because it has a low, very simplistic fight. I don't think that is a fair criticism. I think that people who are saying that are completely missing the point of this entire movie, and possibly even the entire franchise, I think, even. Again, to me, it is not about the fights. It has never been about the fights, and, again, there's always going to be a place for that. Again, I'm not going to say that there isn't, but I don't think that that's the point. And again, I think that if you're criticizing just that aspect and you're not looking at what builds up and what's behind all of it, I do think that you're going to miss out on a truly good spectacle of a movie. And I do think that Godzilla, the Planet Eater, is definitely something to watch if you haven't watched it already, or perhaps if you have watched it and you were disappointed with it, perhaps watch it with a different lens on. Again, thinking of it from a different point of view. So that was my review of Godzilla, the Planet Eater. I definitely enjoyed it, but if you enjoyed this review, then please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, make sure to check out that link in the description or head over to my Patreon page, and any donations are greatly appreciated. But until next time, everyone, bye-bye.